let's go with the quote. So, wherever there are colonizers and the colonized face to face, I see force, brutality, cruelty, sadism, conflict, and in a parody of education, the hasty manufacturing of a few thousand subordinates, functionaries, boys, artisans, office clerks, and interpreters necessary for the smooth operation of business. This is page 21 of my English version of Discourse on Colonialism. And I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First of all, he goes off. I mean, lists it. Brutality, cruelty, sadism, conflict. He calls education a parody in the hasty manufacturing of these subordinates or functionaries. So in this, I'm thinking of, I want to center this episode like we've been doing throughout on how roles are produced in society. So we're removing the individual from it. And we're saying when you are playing the role or enacting the role of a teacher, what are those linguistic discursive fields that are allowed? Which ones are not allowed? What are, the body languages that are allowed? Proxemics, how close you are to students that are allowed, not allowed? What are the variables that matter? And in continuing to think about when we're enacting this role of a teacher, where we agree and disagree with the expectation of enacting that role. That is not saying, this is who I am, Kara. This is saying what is expected of me and how can I, for me, it's a way to make sure that I'm always challenging the dynamics of power and challenging what those expectations of those roles are to be. And why do I think that's so important in this moment is because as a teacher, you always hear, well, that's not my job. That's somebody else's job. And I want to continue to unpack where is that discourse produced that we understand what our job is and where our job ends. And so we're going to continue to think about these agents, or how he calls them, functionaries that are hastily manufactured, meaning it's not even put together necessarily thinking of how to ensure that everybody in a society it receives what they need. And so, and then what is education in colonization is to reproduce the status quo, right? Reproduce European dominance globally. And so these functionaries, and this is a way to stay away from the identity politics that have been weaponized against the working class, and to center on, it doesn't, in this case, these functionaries, you can remove race. We need to insert it back in very quickly, but just, for discussion's sake, you can remove race from a functionary because you could have an Asian teacher, a Latino teacher, white teacher, Jewish teacher, white Jewish, Black Jewish, African-American, Catholic, African-American, Muslim, that can act as a functionary if they're following the rules of the role that they're supposed to be playing and all the laws. And so we're going to look at colonialism specifically through some lenses just to keep the conversation succinct as possible and also drive in the point concretely. So we're going to look at primarily language in schools, right? So school talk or language ideologies that are circulating, that are dominant outside of schools, but how those play up in schools. And this is going to be something that we do over and over and over, but this is a superficial kind of introduction. Lightweight how media supports that kind of the role of dominant language ideologies in school talk and educational policy. That brings us into laws that kind of are correlated with the prison industry, or the increasingly privatization of prison, and even the incarceration engagement of civilian people, and science as well. So education, science, media, laws, prison, we're going to kind of interweave those, starting with education, and then also considering what we analyze with the Common Core today as part of science. So we even throw this word science around, science of reading, standardized English is looked at as a science to acquire or to learn, and it will provide you as the story goes, with all of these opportunities to access capital. And we could talk about different forms of ways that theorists have conceptualized capital. But for now, we're going to stick to the economic capital, which is the dominant form of capital overall. So the goal is always wealth through money, through the dollar in the United States. In many places around the world, because the dollar still is the exchange, the currency of exchange, right? So let's get into it. I'm going to start with reading a little piece of actually my work, but I will give credit where credit is due. And this is just to set up some initial foundational definitions to understanding language and language ideologies. And again, we will continue to unpack this. I hope to have some social linguistics on here to help me through this and work with me. So we're going to start with what is hegemony within a capitalist or colonial framework. It is spontaneous consent given by the great masses of the population to the general direction imposed on social life by the dominant fundamental group. So it's this idea of spontaneous consent, but the direction that is imposed is from the dominant group. It gives rise to unjust competition and is reified in social, public, and even private life. So we're going to look at how that's reified in mainly public life, right? Through laws, education, and science. A key aspect of hegemony is that marginalization is accepted as the natural order of things. English hegemony, undergirded by a monoglot language ideology, has become an action and symbol of power in all levels of U.S. society. So English, now we're switching from hegemony, manufactured consent to reproduce dominant institutions of power and those people who hold that power. Now moving into language, it's English has a power legally and institutionally in the United States that other languages do not. And it is given as naturally we speak English. Here in the United States, you speak English, which is a colonial phrase, if you really wanted to analyze that further. A monoglot ideology rests on the belief that society is, in effect, monolingual and ideologically and materially ascribes a named language to a geographical region or nation state as a colonial imperial project of so-called unification. For example, one language, one nation, one people. This concept did not emerge until colonization, which is why it's directly related to that. So as we know, it's also a myth. It's a language ideology that has power and also a myth. The myth of it is we know that if we point to a geographical location on the map, and pretty much anywhere on the map, we can close our eyes, it is actually multilingual. That includes where you live, that includes where I live. And so why at the same time we know that, and we can point to a place on the map like Mexico and say they speak Spanish, which ignores completely colonization in the sense that it's a European language, and how does a European language become dominant in the New World, if you will, and what we now call the Americas? Why is it European languages that we teach in schools like French, German, and Spanish? And then likewise, why are indigenous languages silenced? So the 30-some indigenous languages or more that are spoken in Mexico are no longer thought of, but yet they exist. And so again, it is in the profession of unity. There's no way that we can exist healthily and comfortably and without oppression if we aren't all speaking the same language. And as we know, this works to oppress the other. Okay, so that's all about what colonization does. Is it others people? It compartmentalizes those people and then blames them for their oppression. And so we need to think about this. Let's continue to think about the mechanization of man. So when we're talking about playing roles as a teacher, and how we work to perpetuate this English hegemony in our classrooms, and then also what we can do to resist it. So let's keep going. Hierarchization of language is based on a construct that arbitrarily standardizes a colonial language and positions it as superior. In other words, the use of language as an instrument of domination constructs itself as an object of desire. And this is Mignolo. For example, the first ever prescribed grammar book can be traced back to the Spanish language in Antonio de Nebrija, who wrote Gramática de la Lengua Castellana in 1492, which again is when this colonial project is emerging, which played a major role in Spain's imperial expansion. Linguistic hierarchization has material consequences which tend to be beneficial for the capitalist and oligarch class of speakers, generally of European descent in the United States, and repressive for which they deem the other. For example, Mignolo notes that Spanish, once a powerful colonial language, has suffered several historical demotions, one in Latin America and Equatorial Guinea after World War II, becoming the language of the large part of the global South. And then again in the United States, becoming the language of an ethnic and racialized minority. So it's the point here is no one's safe. That's the point. And I want to repeat that no one's safe. You might feel safe now, but the bar moves constantly in order to make sure that those people in positions of power remain there. And the way that they can do that is to ensure that they have capital to support all of those projects. So in one way that hierarchization in language education has been materialized is through what researchers call the standard language ideology, and this is where it comes into play in our classrooms. A bias toward an abstracted, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant bloc institutions and which names as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class and is reinforced in schools. So again, this is the perception. So in this standard language ideology, it is the way that people perceive the language, not necessarily actually the language that people are speaking. So when we look at the written word, it is not saying that white middle class people actually speak like that, like that's inherent. It is the way that it is perceived by the listener, that white people, it is the most resemblance of the spoken language of white people is the written form. Labov has done a study that has rejected that claim, and he proved that indeed the people who most closely stuck to standardized English rules was the poor white people. They stuck more closely and adhered more to the constructs of standard language ideology. But again, it's not really about what's real. It's about the myth, right? And it's about continuing to perpetuate the myth and gaining inertia for that. So to end with the definition, I'm thinking of, language and how languages are othered in the United States. When institutional recognition is bestowed on a human capacity, it makes competition possible among those that have created the criteria that defines and establishes merit. Standardization of language is a European construct to maintain dominance, and its power is reified through various mechanisms such as prescriptive grammars, the field of linguistics, and dictionaries. An example that's closely related to education is the requirement of high-stakes testing in U.S. public schools that both assess in and assess standard language. Predominance of white middle-class teachers, hierarchization of language varieties in curriculum, error correction and grading practices, placement practices, and the standard language ideology's connection to college acceptance, scholarship, and hiring practices. So now we're going to look at, I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to look at what this looks like concretely. So again, that's a definition. It's very abstract. Where do we find this? Well, just open your eyes. Here's one way. I wanted to go first into, so this is Common Core, core standards. As you know, I'll leave all these resources for you. I got a hell of a lot of resources to share. This is Common Core. This is something that you guys are all familiar with. These are the standards that we use in the United States. Sometimes we can use like Iowa's standard, Iowa Common Core as well, but the resemblance is real. So we're just looking at the Common Core because this is what covers most public schools as far as their standards. And even thinking of the word standard as the neutral term, and then everything that is non-standard as the other. So this is colonization of othering what is not standard right in the standards. So again, you can pretty much close your eyes, take your pick of where you want to go, and you're going to find some colonial residue or explicit colonialism in these standards. But let's look at language first. So I think it's interesting that it's just said like, this is what language is. Know what type of language are we learning or for what purpose. It's just language. And here's where you see, you can, again, take your pick. We can go to grade 6. And here's where you start to see these words coming into play. And this is what teachers use, right? So this is we're bound by this when we're enacting the role of the agent of the state of a teacher. We're expected to follow these standard English conventions. And it's not, again, we don't even, it's manufactured consent. Sometimes we don't even feel pressure to do it. We feel like it's God's work, like, right? Like we're doing that. And so let's look at what they say. Demonstrate command of the conventions of standard English grammar usage when writing or speaking. So we have that standard English right there, right? Reifying that it's something that is not socially constructed and not made up by European colonizers, but it is in fact natural and an aspiration, a goal, if you will, and something that our smart, charitable selves, benevolent selves can teach you in order to not be othered, even though you'll always be othered, or in order for you to assimilate into our culture as somebody that is on the bottom of the ladder, if you are othered. Okay, so we also need to think of words like grammar and usage, and this is not only with writing, but also speaking. Ensure that pronouns are in the proper case. Use intensive pronouns. Recognize and correct inappropriate shifts in pronoun, number, and person. Recognize and correct vague pronouns. Recognize variations from standard English in their own and others' writing, speaking, and identify and use strategies to improve expression in conventional language. So saying, yeah, you might be able to express it in your home language, but it's only improved conventionally if you can express it in standard American English. And so then the question becomes what does this do to languages that are othered or marginalized language? What does this do to Black speakers of Black English? What does this do to speakers of other languages? What does it do to speakers, EL students, etc.? So we need to continue to ask our questions, and we're going to continue to, take our jabs at that. I'm purposely not going into theories that work to combat this for now. We're just looking at how colonization works concretely, giving you guys spell correctly, period. Like what? Punctuation, knowledge of language conventions. And what I think is so interesting is as I become a teacher educator, I'll ask students, like in your language arts class, like wasn't the goal like to write in standard English? And they would oftentimes not even know what that is. So which is such a good point of what colonization does, in the sense that like you don't even know it's there. It's just working. It's working. But it's not conscious all the time. So they don't know what it is, but yet these rules were applied to them, and then they're also expected to carry on this project of othering languages, and which also tend to other the working class and racialized people or any marginalized person, period. Vocabulary acquisition, it's the assumption that the academic vocabulary that is something different from any other type of vocabulary. And then we just need to ask ourselves, like, what do we define as academic and why? And other ways to redefine what academic is and sounds like, looks like. So, and you can, that's 6th grade. You can go to 11th grade language standards. And again, this is supposedly for everybody. So while it's most relative to like your English language arts teachers, because it's under the standard of language, this is the expectation throughout all of the different subjects. So again, a little bit, we still have spell correctly 11th grade. We had it in 6th grade. You see, these are like reiterative, so they just keep getting circled back and a little bit more abstract. So, they might be able to resolve issues of complex or contested usage, but they have to consult references, and those references tend to be Euro-centered. And so this is the problem we're constantly finding ourselves in. It's like, oh, you can think in complex ways, you can think critically, but you have to use the Webster's Dictionary of English Usage. You can't use Cesaire because I might get in trouble, right? I might get my license taken away. And so when we think of what Cesaire says was forced labor, and that's in like a sense of like you have to work to pay your bills, intimidation, pressure. That's an example of this pressure or this, well, we have a law now, so if you teach anything that has to do with systemic racism, then you could lose your license, or have to go through some court litigation or whatever. So that's that pressure and intimidation through our legal branch, and that's why I want to highlight that today too, because it all goes together. It's hard to separate. It's hard to parse out. So he also says, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinishness, brainless elites, degraded masses. So we're going to continue to, again, unpack that next quote, again, just going off: theft, rape, compulsory crops, etc. So again, take a look at this. And then if this is what is neutral, if this is what is the expected natural goal of language, anything you go into, speaking and listening, it's already expected that standard English is what is to be assimilated to, and only the other has to assimilate, because the white middle class speaker, no matter how they actually talk, is already the reflection of that standard language ideology. So again, you can read through all of the other type of standards, but thinking of what standard language ideology does, and then also testing, right? So the ISASP tests in the state of Iowa, every state has their own testing services that are mandated by the state. So this is an obligatory business, just like he says, the smooth operation of business. So there's real money in this. We act like education is like public servants and a social service, and it's still state capitalism, because we have, major pouring of our tax dollars into private entities that work to perpetuate the system. And so ISASP is run by Pearson's. And so this is a state law you have to test, and Pearson's is worth $9.9 billion. We can look at ACT, we can look at SAT, all these different testing companies as well. Curriculums, how much are curriculum companies worth, etc. in order to continue to fulfill this project. So through laws, through education, through the media, all of these avenues are just, it's a bit, again, in the air we breathe.